So we're glad to have you with us, and we hope that you will enjoy the study this morning. We are in Daniel chapter 6. We're towards the end of the story, but there's still plenty to be discussed. And as we have done in the past, once we wrap up chapter 6, we'll look at the design of this chapter and see what is one of the central points that the writer is trying to have us focus on. And so we'll talk more about that after we finish chapter 6. This feels really loud. We're going to go down a little bit. There we go. Before we begin, let's start with a word of prayer. Our wonderful God and Father in heaven, King Most High, thank you so much for your word and the comfort it is to be able to search out the truths that are held in it, and to see how you have been working out the plan of salvation from days of old. That well before your Son ever stepped foot on this earth, you were talking of his majesty and of his power that he would wield on your behalf. And that is a great joy to be able to look into these things. Father, as we look at the life of Daniel and the kings that wrestled with who you are, help us to see the truths and the realities that they come to understand, and the nature of who you are that is revealed in how you operate. God, thank you for this time we have to study your word. Help us to handle it wisely and encourage one another in the way that we look into it. And this we pray in your Son, our Savior's name. Amen. All right, so Daniel chapter 6, I believe we got through verse 24. And so we have seen Daniel be thrown into the lion's den. King Darius comes racing out and is crying out for Daniel and trying to see if Daniel has survived the night. And much to the king's joy, Daniel is alive. And we saw right at the end of verse 24 that as a result, Darius goes and throws these men into the lion's den that had been the source of Daniel's trouble. Not only the men, but their children and their wives. And as he's thinking about all that's taken place, we then open up in verse 25 and read about Darius's response. So let's read that together. Verse 25 through the end of the chapter. Then King Darius wrote to all the prophets, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is a living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, or Cyrus the Persian. All right, take just a moment. Mark that up, and then we'll talk about what questions you have or what observations stand out to you. So I'll give you a moment of silence here. All right, what do you notice or what questions do you have about this section? Also, do we have someone running? Okay, Tom's got the mic. Gary,
Well, it's interesting that this king would say he is the living God. He's the only God that's living, and he's the only God that anyone could say that about.
Yeah, and it's a unique way that he's looking at God now, because he is living and active, in other words. He's not a God that's distant and not active and not taking part in what's taking place on earth. He's living and breathing in that sense. Aaron?
Well, it's a step in the right direction for the king. The decree is good intention, is what I would say about it. You can't really tell people to tremble in fear. That's not really something you can command. And that is not really the greatest decree to make, to tremble and fear. Not to worship, but to tremble in fear. So at the very least, he's recognizing the power of this particular God,
Right.
which we know is the only true living God.
Right.
So it's a step in the right direction.
Sure. And maybe it's written from an earthly king perspective, right? As you're going and conquering nations and tribes and trying to get them to come in and assimilate to your culture, what do you want them to do? Fear you so that they'll comply. And so maybe he's trying to replicate that and saying, I recognize that this God is, in other words, a king. He never states that directly, but he recognizes him as a king and says we should tremble and fear before him. Now, I would say it's at least a step further in the right direction than the last time that we saw a king make a decree about worshiping God or honoring God. Where have we seen kings, in Daniel specifically, make reference to writing to all the peoples, nations, languages that dwell on earth with a decree? Where do we see this? Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we saw it in chapter 3, kind of at the end there. There's earlier ones, but the most recent two in the book of Daniel is chapter 3 and verse 29. There, as Nebuchadnezzar is making the decree to all people, nations, languages that speak anything. If you speak anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Here, Nebuchadnezzar saying, at least don't say anything bad about him, right? There, it's not quite a submit to him, but just don't dishonor him in any way. Don't say anything bad. And then turns around in chapter 4 and verse 1 and has a similar language. To King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and the wonders that the Most High has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. There, Nebuchadnezzar is at least just revealing and putting God before them, but doesn't really make a decree that the people should do anything with that. And now we have Darius trying to say, you need to pay attention to this God. It's not enough to just not say anything bad about him. It's not just enough to recognize him. You should have a response. And that, in part, is to fear and tremble before him, which is an appropriate response. But like you said, can you really command that someone tremble in fear? Or do they have to have that instilled within them by looking at that king in that way? Any other thoughts on that, or what other observations? Miss Kay has something.
Well, he says that the living God, enduring forever, shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. How did he know all that?
And Robin's going, that was my question. So I'm going to say, who has the answer? Robin had something to add to that, I think.
Just that he delivers and rescues, he works signs and wonders, and then in heaven, and on earth. Well, he saw something happen on earth, but what about the heaven thing?
Okay, good questions. Anyone have thoughts on that? Anyone have insight about that? Possibly by Holy Spirit. Mark has a thought, though.
I have an opinion.
He has an opinion.
I don't know the answers. But when I read anything that's eternal about God, it's executed and finished through Jesus. And for me, that's how God makes eternal anything between him and mankind. And I see it as a prophecy. May not be messianic. I know a lot of people probably don't see it that way. But we have the blessing of being able to see how God accomplishes the eternal kingdom. And that's through the revelation of what Jesus brings, which is the revelation
Sure.
of who we are and God is.
Absolutely. Todd?
Yeah, so I've got to guess at it. I can't. Opinion is probably a good way too, and I'm trying to catch up a little bit because I haven't read Daniel in a while, so I kind of went back. But yeah, like going back to like verse 6 of chapter 6, where he's, these guys are trying to set up the trap for him, and just multiple times, right? May King Darius live forever. And even when Daniel was in the lion's den, he said, didn't he say, may the king live forever or something?
Yes.
Yeah. Verse 21. Daniel answered, may the king live forever. So here's my hot take on it. We'll see. You have the king, and these guys are trying to set him up, and they say this guy, they go out of their way to say, write up this law that they can only worship you. And he kind of they almost forced his hand, it seemed. And he clearly likes the phrase, King Darius, please live forever. And we hear it a couple of times. And then even Daniel says it, which at first I thought, hold on. That's a small K for king, he's not saying that he's God or anything. And then he gets out, and I almost wonder if it's a change of heart from Darius. Because he's like, I am not the king. I will not live forever. And maybe I'm reading way too much into it. And he realizes that what just happened, and with what happened to the people that were thrown in and just gobbled up immediately,
Sure.
He realizes, wow, there is a real king, and that lives forever, and I'm not that.
Okay.
That can do that.
Sure. And I've got a couple comments over here with Aubriana and Paul, so we'll let them figure out who's going first.
I don't know what caused Darius to have all these insights, but I think it's interesting that, as Kay pointed out, 3 times we get the reference of God's dominion being everlasting. Mm-hmm. And thinking about earlier in the chapter, the order or the law that was supposed to be everlasting, and it wasn't, because it couldn't stand against God's dominion, which is the true everlasting thing.
Sure.
So that's the first thing I notice. And then as far as he performs signs and wonders in heavens and on the earth, to me, it's not the incredible thing that God rules over the heavens, because that's where we typically think of gods, or in Darius's case, the gods being. But to me, it reminds me of chapter 2, verse 11,
okay,
where the wise men who are brought before Nebuchadnezzar to interpret the dream say that the gods don't dwell with mortals. And Darius is seeing right before his eyes God of the heavens acting on earth,
sure,
with mortals, caring about an individual, Daniel, and the beauty of that the gods who seem so far away, this God actually does dwell with his people and is actively protecting them.
Great. Let Paul.
Yeah, I had a little bit of that to say, where Darius probably had a little bit of understanding of what the idea of gods may be.
Good.
But there's also a level which Darius is having this first step, as Aaron said, through Daniel's suffering. And it's important to note that if it wasn't for Daniel to go through this, Darius probably wouldn't have this kind of thoughts or experiences. And I'm not entirely sure what's going on from 24 to 25, if there's any context in between that. I don't want to say there is or anything. But I don't think it would be too far to say that he may have gotten this information from Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, certainly possible that Daniel disclosed more insight in that period. I think it's a gathering of what all has been said. Let's put it from the perspective of those who were living at that time. I think chapter 2 and verse 11 is a great context. That these people even believed that there were gods. And that the gods chose who to help the king that would succeed. Right? The gods were the power behind many things. They had the power over the pleasures of life, and if things went bad, natural disasters came, it must have been a god that commanded that. It must have been a god who's brought this next kingdom in to try to attack us. Part of their struggle is they kept it on the plural. There was a god of this and a god of that and a god of this. And what Darius is actually wrestling with now is there's a supreme God. As Nebuchadnezzar puts it, the Most High God, right? So as he's talking here, part of this idea of recognizing that there is this king that is above me is also recognition that there's a king that is above the law that we hold as supreme. Because remember, for the Medes and the Persians, law above king. So the king could write a law into commandment, but he could never change it. So law was always premium. And now here comes this God, this being that Darius has not considered with any great effort before. And this God subverts the law, subverts the nature of the lions that are hungry, devouring Daniel. And he is seeing this God work on earth. Keeping in mind that they recognize that the gods were not of earth. They were of the heavens. And so it's not beyond their comprehension to say, this is a God who reigns in both heaven and earth. He has power heaven and earth. Yes?
To kind of add to what
The
you're
name.
saying. To
Mark,
add to what you're
thank
saying.
you.
Again, if we project out to the Christ, Daniel did break the law. He broke that law. And yet, we see the dispensing of that law by God.
Yeah,
Same thing happened when Jesus comes.
absolutely.
This is when I see it, it's a total projection of what's going to happen later.
Sure. I would also add to what Todd said and was highlighting, this idea that from an earthly perspective, the greatest honor you would give to a king is to say, I hope you and your kingdom last forever. To say anything less than that says, I don't have faith in you as king, I don't trust you as king, and I hope that your kingdom ends because I'm ready for a new king to come in and fix this. And so what Darius is doing is recognizing that this God has a power that he now desires would last forever. And he's recognizing that it's a power that can and will last forever because it was able to easily dismiss the law of the land. So I would add that to the context as well. Any other thoughts or questions? Steve, and then Aaron.
Yeah, I have a interesting, take, I guess, to say. When I look at it, I don't think that Darius thought that just because Daniel was saved from the lion's den that he completely changed his mind at that point. I actually think that there was a lot of things that were going on leading up to that, just his relationship with Daniel. We don't know what kind of conversations Daniel's had with him, and it seems like the people knew that, visually knew what Daniel was doing with his God, because they wanted to use that as a trap for him. So I just think that there's things leading up to
Daniel's faith and the reason why Darius would want to follow God other than just the lion's den.
Sure. So let's maybe put it, this is how I might word that, okay? Because I think I get what you're saying, so let's test this out a little bit. Let's say Daniel and Darius had not had the relationship they had. Darius had not seen Daniel doing the things he did and did not honor him in the beginning. And then this law comes out, Daniel's brought before him, he's thrown in the lion's den, and Daniel survives. Who does Darius attribute it to at that point? A God. There's a being that's beyond, which would have just added to his construct of there's plural of gods. But it's because of the relationship that Daniel had with Darius, that Darius knew Daniel's character, Darius knew Daniel's faith in his God, and then sees that faith lived out in continuing to pray 3 times a day, continuing to do the things that he's always done in honor of his God and his king, that when Daniel does survive, I think it does make that switch from a plurality to Daniel's God is unlike any other God I've seen in action, and he is actively taking an approach here. And so from that standpoint, yes, it's not just the survival of Daniel, but it's because of Daniel's proof of his faith leading up to it that it really convicts Darius. Is that kind of what you were saying? Cool. Aaron.
You said it a few times in your response there, Daniel's God.
Yeah.
And when Darius comes to the lion's den to check on him, he says, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lion?
Right.
And in the decree, he says, the God of Daniel.
Right.
And so he's recognizing Daniel's God, and it's still Daniel's God. It's not Darius's.
Right. Yeah, he hasn't quite brought it to himself like Nebuchadnezzar did by chapter 4, where he's kind of bringing it to a relationship. But he's at least recognizing this is a king, unlike any other god. Okay, anything else there? What else do you notice from this text? I think there's a couple other interesting things. Steve has got a comment back there.
I think there's, well, I think you can find it there where Solomon talks about time. There was said that the Bible was not chronological necessarily, but there's, I think, what Aaron said here and some of the material has to. I think there are these events that have happened that often are humiliating to the person who, let's see, what can we say? Nebuchadnezzar lost his gateman into the fire because he didn't do that right, and then the guy after Nebuchadnezzar was writing on a wall, and the hand came alive. Anyway, you get eventually to stuff. I always wondered where Esther took place. Well, that was probably along the way when you got the featured character building a gallows, so everybody can see him. It's probably, interesting things, the humiliating how much time they affect and how other people they group together and affect, and it goes into both directions.
Sure. And so what we see taking place here, much like the ones that you referred to, you have with Esther, you have the gallows that ends up humiliating Haman. You've got various situations within Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar, his own guards are consumed by the fire, making a fool of him, kind of humiliating his power and strength. And you've got some others throughout Daniel. And here with Darius, he's written this law that he thinks is supreme, and there's a bit of humiliation towards that earthly kingdom, and showing, and maybe I might switch from humiliation to just an overpowering. and a proving that the power they think they have is not as strong as it is, right? It's not as strong as they feel it is. So great observation there. Sure. So there's a couple other phrases in here that I think are interesting. So let's look at this poetry, or this recognition of who God is. We looked about the enduring forever, never be destroyed, shall be to the end. But what else do we notice here? What other words might pop out to you, or phrases there? Yeah, he delivers and rescues. What's the difference there in your mind? What is Darius recognizing? Why both? Dave, we're getting the mic back to you there.
Thank you. What I see
Sure.
is steadfastness, trust in God.
Great.
Under all the duress there, and he just wasn't going to be dissuaded. It just wasn't going to happen. Take it for what you will, you know.
Sure. Okay. Any other thoughts on this idea of deliverance and rescue? Mark.
I'm not sure. Other than this is yet another sign. This is an evidentiary thing that this is evidence. Again, God is revealing himself to these kings, and I kind of ask the question, why would God want to reveal himself to these kings? Well, it all has to do with what happens later.
Sure.
And especially when we get in these following chapters, when he's parsing out other kings, and it's just God revealing himself to other people, not just the one people that he supposedly chose, only one people. He's everybody's God.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see God deliver and rescue his people. I mean, just think of Exodus. He rescues them from bondage and delivers them through the wilderness. I mean, there's this idea that it's not just a moment in time which God does this. It's a continual deliverance and a continual rescuing. And so it's that idea that he's recognizing how powerful God was through every stage of what he's witnessed with Daniel and this decree. Aaron?
Deliverance is like a freedom. It's being freed from something.
Yeah.
Rescue is removed from danger.
Right.
I think those are the two ideas there.
Yeah.
Daniel was able to worship his God regardless of the law that had been put in place. And so he was free to conduct himself in a way that he wished based on his obedience and love for his God, even in bondage, even under the rule of law. He was delivered from that because, like we said last week, God is supreme to the law, just like the law was supreme to the king.
Sure.
God is overruling all of those things. And so as servants of his, we can be delivered even when we are in these circumstances under an oppressive government. We can choose to face that.
Sure.
And be obedient in the face of that risk, danger, and be delivered and rescued.
Sure. Excellent. Names this morning are not going to serve me. Why can't I think?
It's fine.
Arlinda, thank you. Sorry.
I thought of Proverbs 1:7, where it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And this King Darius, I guess he's beginning to increase his knowledge about the real God. Also, I wanted to mention Ecclesiastes 12:13, where it says, fear God and keep his commandments.
Sure. Yeah, and that is kind of the the interesting nature of what Aaron had pointed out towards the beginning. You can't command fear, but Darius's statement is surprisingly accurate. You need to fear this God, because it is the beginning of all knowledge. Fear God, keep his commandments, right? That is a theme that is throughout Scripture. Michi, and then we'll wrap up this chapter.
So in the beginning it says, for he's the living God, and so we see in that portion it's the characteristics of God.
Yes.
And then in 27 it says, okay, well, what does he do? Like, this is who he is, but what are his actions? And it says he delivers and rescues. When the analogy is, when we think of what a delivery is, when we order something on Amazon, we want something delivered to us because we want it. But in order for us to understand how God delivers us, what is he delivering us from? It's a place where we don't want to be. So delivering us and rescuing, where are we, and how can he rescue us from where we don't want to be? Where is he? I'm the package. I'm in one location, and God's delivering me from that to rescue me to a better location, which is his kingdom, which he had described in the beginning. It's enduring forever, and it's not going to be destroyed. And then he gives proof of that deliverance by then saying he delivered Daniel from the power of the lions, which was that danger, into safety.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It absolutely makes sense. I like it. I like the example. As a result of this, Dave has a thought.
When I said, excuse me, earlier about his, what did I say? Daniel did something unique here.
Yes.
He could have easily buckled and, right? But he, because of his steadfastness and his trust in God, who saw that? It wasn't just Darius. Who saw it?
The whole kingdom.
That's right. And that's the thing I was thinking when I said that, because
Gotcha.
And we need to adopt that mentality, because if we do that, no matter what's going wrong in our lives, we need to come to our senses and do what God says so that we are an example. And then they end up looking and go, I don't understand why you're suffering so much in this life and you're still so steadfast.
Right.
And that's, it's not, to me, it's not simply just being delivered. He did it because he was obedient to God. That's why God delivered him.
Right.
We got to keep that in our mind. It's not like you're delivered because I like you. It's
Right.
because you're faithful and you suffer for me. And it's a strong message that we need to think about.
Absolutely.
And how we can suffer for him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's great. Great reminder for us. So as we end the chapter then, what happens? Daniel's restored to a position. He's prospers and he continues during the reign of Darius. That continues to be the theme throughout. And then Kay, last comment, and then let's look at the design of the chapter.
I was just going to say, I think this is a first reference to Cyrus, isn't it?
I believe so. Yes.
Except in other books like Isaiah. But
correct, yes. In Daniel's narrative, yes. Because in chapter 6, we open up that it is about Darius being set over the kingdom, and it's Darius who, at the end of chapter 3 or 5, is also the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So, yes, this is the first time we see Cyrus, which we talked about at the beginning of chapter 6 here, that we have Darius is second in line to Cyrus, who is reigning as supreme. Okay, so as we look at this book, one of the things we've done with each of the chapters so far is notice that there is a certain structure and design to how the book is written. We've been talking about it being a chiastic structure, that as you get in, as you run through the narrative, the first and the last part of the story somehow parallel or are in contrast to one another, and the story is almost exactly the same. There might be similar wording or similar themes, and then as you work towards what the author wants you to see as the central point, it continues to mimic that way. So with Daniel chapter 6, we open up, and Darius is showing favor to Daniel. I mean, Darius is putting him over the satraps, and he's, as I think someone mentioned in our class, or maybe something I read, he's over a third of the kingdom. And it's a big kingdom. It's the Medes and the Persians. They are the world power at that point. And he's over a third of them. What happens next in the story? Well, he signs this decree at the urging of these satraps. His wise men come, and he signs this decree, or I think it even calls it an injunction. After that, some of those men now go and accuse Daniel to the king. They go and show the king, hey, Daniel's done this thing wrong. Let me show you what he's done against the law. Followed up by Darius being in distress. Remember, he's in anguish, and he takes the rest of the day to try to figure out, how can I avoid throwing Daniel in the lion's den? I don't want to do this. This is wrong. He's over a third of my kingdom. I got to save this guy. I like him. He's good for my kingdom. Darius then orders Daniel to the lions in chapter 6, verses 15 through 17. And of course, then in verses 18 through 20, Darius asks Daniel if God has delivered him. So we're waiting to see the sign. Does Daniel get delivered? Of course, Daniel is delivered because God's angel has delivered him from the lions in chapter 6, 21 through 22. Darius then is exceedingly glad. He's excited at the idea that Daniel survived. Then the men who accuse Daniel are then sentenced to death. Darius then makes this decree that we've been studying this morning, this decree over trembling and fearing before the God of Daniel. And finally, Daniel prospers during the reign of Darius. Now, if we're just lining them up, that's the story. When we look at a chiastic structure, one of the things that we look at is how they mimic each other. And so we can kind of put it in this format, where our central theme then becomes point F here, Darius asking Daniel if God has delivered him. So really what the author is trying to get us to see at the heart of this story is not the deliverance of Daniel. That's just part of the story. What he's trying to get us to focus on is Darius, this Mede and Persian king, who is now curious to find out, has your God proven his power and authority and saved you from the lions? So let's read that section, chapter 6, 18 through 20. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So if this is the heart of the message, according to a chiastic structure, which is how this is written, what is the importance of this section or this question that Darius offers? How does that help us to understand the point of chapter 6? Or what applications does it put in your mind? Seek God. Seek God and his deliverance, right? This is ultimately what the king recognizes. He rescues and delivers. Okay, anything else there? Oh, Elizabeth, right? Okay. We don't have the microphone. It's in the back, so go for it. That's a proof of his power and his authority and that he is alive and able to do that. So yes, it is the turning point. Isn't it also the turning point for anyone in their life? To ask the question, is this God able to deliver? If we're not asking that question, it doesn't matter what knowledge we get about God. It doesn't matter what information we see in the scriptures. If we're not making that connection, does your God have the power to deliver you? If we don't believe that, then we don't believe that Christ has the power to save us. It's the heart of the gospel. Is Christ who he says he is, and is he going to deliver us when he comes again? Steve.
I'm thinking about the gift of hope.
Okay,
the
gift of hope.
The gift of hope, because, you can think about being delivered and all that kind of stuff, but the process of hoping is like an ongoing thing that starts early and keeps you going.
And to that point, Darius had lost his hope. He couldn't save Daniel. He had to put Daniel in the lion's den, double sealed with both signet rings of his and his leaders. He had no way of impacting the outcome for Daniel, and he felt at odds with himself. He could not reconcile it, and he was wallowing all night long in how did it come to this? And all that he could rely on at that point was hope that Daniel's God delivered him. And that is the hope that we all rely on. Michi has something to add for us.
To add on to that, Hebrews 11:1, the CSB version says that reality or faith is the reality of what's hoped for. And for Darius, he was like, the reality of Daniel dying was not what he wanted, so he had to put his faith in his God in that moment because he hoped that Daniel would live.
Right. Yeah, and he got the proof that God was able to deliver. And that leads him to, even though he's trying to force or demand fear or trembling, I think at least he has renewed and confirmed that hope at this point by the time he gets to the point where he says he does deliver and rescue and work signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. Cool. Yeah, Gary.
I just like the way Elizabeth phrased her comment or question, part of her comment or question.
Okay.
Is God real?
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to, a good question and a good answer to realize.
Yeah, and that's part of what Darius confirms. Not only is he real, but he's living. Right? He is a living, real God that we should be looking at and considering. At minimum, fearing and honoring at best. All right. Before we move on to chapter 7, I'll throw this chart up, and this is one I found in one of my studies that helps us to really, as we've talked about, there's a chiastic structure from chapter 2 to chapter 7. And so what we see here is a comparison of chapters 3 and chapter 6, how there is almost the identical. It's a little small, I understand, so if you want a copy, I can make it available. But in both of them, you have a malicious speaker addressing the king, going and trying to subvert the Jews, right? Then a new royal law is made. A threat of punishment by death is made. God's servants are faithful, and in their faithfulness, they're accused of subverting the kingdom. And so there's this punishment carried out against God's servants, and then a statement is made concerning God's ability to deliver. That gets followed up by God intervening with an angel. You have one in the fiery furnace, you have one in the lion's den. And then you have no harm to the servants can be discerned after the rescue. There's not a scratch. There's not something wrong with Daniel coming out of the lion's den. There's not even the smell of smoke on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's nothing discernible that touched them. And then others die by the same punishment that God's servants survived. We were reminded that by Steve this morning, that those men that were told to carry them in, they were burned by the fire. And here we have the ones that subverted Daniel. They're thrown into the lion's den and consumed. Then a new royal decree is made after God's servants are rescued. And finally, something that we see in almost every chapter up to this point, that God's faithful servants prosper as a result of their faithfulness and reliance on God. And we see that in every chapter so far. All right, so if you want that, I can send that out if you'll text or email me, and I'll get that out to you. And then next week we'll start chapter 7. So looking forward to that. This is the first one that gets into like true prophetic language. So let's have fun with it. All right? See you in just a moment. We're going to take a break, and then we'll reconvene for our period of worship and praise to God. So.